Everyone, and thank you for participating in today's webinar hosted by the National Latina Network for Healthy Families and Communities, a project of Casa de Esperanza that builds bridges and connections among research, practice, and policy to advance effective responses to eliminate domestic violence and to promote healthy relationships within Latino families and communities. My name is Jose Juan Lara Jr., team member of the National Latina Network, and the title for today's webinar is Speaking Out in Unity, the Utility of Testimonios from Undocumented Latina Immigrant Women to Address Intimate Partner Violence Help-Seeking Experiences. In this webinar, Dr. Miriam Valdovinos, principal investigator of this research study, will share the one-on-one interviews conducted with Latina immigrant women living in Washington State who experience intimate partner violence, investigating how the women's undocumented immigration status impacted their experience with help-seeking attempts and behaviors for intimate partner violence. Culturally relevant Testimonio Interviews were conducted to qualitatively investigate the complexity of intimate partner violence and how immigration status, ethnicity, class, gender, and informal and formal social supports impacted their experience. Findings from the research will reveal racialized, gendered, and classed, and nativist injustices Latina immigrants experience, along with healing, empowerment, and advocacy when seeking social support. Seeking support from informal and informal social support systems as undocumented individuals meant they encountered barriers attached to their immigration status. Furthermore, their intimate partner violence experiences were mediated through structural forms of oppression, such as racism and economic exploitation, especially when they interacted with formal social support systems. These findings inform social service practices regarding identity, intersectionalities that increase intimate partner violence vulnerabilities for undocumented women and contribute to culturally responsive interventions. But before we start, I want to review a couple of housekeeping details. Throughout the webinar, please remember to mute yourselves if you're joining by phone or via your computer. If you're joining us using your phone or an agency phone, please keep in mind that sometimes agencies may have hold music. So if you put us on hold, that music will play throughout the webinar and it will be heard. If you have any questions, submit them in the Ask a Question box in the lower right-hand corner on the screen. We will be taking questions throughout the presentation, just be aware of that. We will also be providing closed captioning as well. This webinar will be recorded and uploaded to the National Latina Network website. Any resources mentioned will be sent to participants after the call and will also receive a survey after exiting the webinar. We kindly ask that you fill it out since this really helps us in shaping future content for our webinars. I'd also like to invite you to join the National Latina Network for Healthy Families and Communities. Through the network, you will receive updates on public policy, research, and training opportunities. You can join the network by visiting our website at www.nationallatinonetwork.org. With that, I'd like to introduce our presenter, Dr. Miriam Valdovinos, an assistant professor at the University of Connecticut School of Social Work. Welcome, Dr. Valdovinos.
Thank you, Jose Juan, and thank you to the National Latina Network and Casa Esperanza for this opportunity to share about this project. Before I get started with the actual presentation, I would like to know who's in the audience. So if you can take a couple minutes just to respond to this question here, which category best describes your primary role? So I just want to know how many practitioners are in the attending the webinar, as well as researchers, and if you're in the field of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, or sexual assault, or other social services. And if you see that none of these categories represent what your primary role is in your work, you could just select other. Any other folks that would like to respond before we move on? Take a couple more moments. Okay, thank you for your responses. This helps me just to get a sense of who's in my audience. So thank you, I appreciate it. It looks like we have mostly practitioners already in the field, so that's very helpful for me to know as I'm going through my presentation. So for today, I just want to give you an idea of what I'll be talking about. So I will first introduce myself, who I am, as that is an important part of the context of why this research study was a part of the work I did in my dissertation, or during my PhD program. I will also talk about the goals of the project, so what were the research objectives. I'll talk about what we did as part of the project, what the women shared, so the findings of the interviews that we conducted for the project. And we'll finish up with why does this matter? So particularly implications around practice in social service practice and research. So first off, I want to mention who I am. So usually when I start with this part of the introduction, I like to say that I'm the daughter of Jorge and Juana Valdovinos. Both my parents migrated from Michoacán, Mexico in the 1970s. And so I identify as Mexican American, I identify as a Chicana woman, and part of my roots from Michoacán also include indigenous roots to the Purépecha people. So even though, because I was born and raised in the United States, there has been complexity of what this indigeneity meant. And I feel oftentimes my experience was very fragmented because I would only visit Mexico during vacation time or holidays. But I was very aware growing up that my family had ties to indigenous communities back in Michoacán. And it became very relevant to me, or very prominent for me, when my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, my mom's dad, passed away in 2014, and as part of his funeral, the indigenous community came out to honor his legacy and the work he had done in the community. So I think at that moment, I was able really to understand more of what this meant for my family and for my ancestors. Also, as part of my introduction, I want to share where I've practiced, which also means this is where I've lived. So I grew up, born and raised in Anaheim, California, Southern California. So that's where I started most of my practice work in domestic violence shelters. When I moved to Fort Worth, Texas, I continued this work, as well as doing educational programs in the community, particularly the Spanish community. So this often included doing different types of workshops in the community, doing different kinds of collaborations with media and with schools in the area. And then I moved into doing more work around juvenile probation. From there, I moved to Seattle, Washington, where I completed my PhD. So during this time, I was doing some practice work part-time, mostly doing children advocates work in domestic violence shelter. And then now, I'm here in Hartford, Connecticut, second year as an assistant professor at the University of Connecticut. So lately, most of my work in this area has been as a community member. You know, I'm still learning who all I can partner up with in this area. People are starting to get to know me, so you know, it's taking a little while to get going, and especially when it comes to the research that continues to happen here. So before I get into the research goals and what we did, I wanted to start with acknowledgement. And first off, I want to thank the 20 courageous women that shared their testimonios. The names that you see listed here are all pseudonyms or alias names to protect the confidentiality of the women. I also want to thank my research analysis team. This included Gina, Tanya, Yvette, and Madeleine. Without them, this critical process would have not happened the way it did. All four of these women brought expertise to the table around mental health, legal advocacy, working with community services in the state of Washington, and most importantly, cultural awareness. So all four of them identify as Latina or with different ethnic groups within the larger Latino group. So it helped to really add a layer to the, an analytical layer of cultural responsiveness as we were looking at the interview data. I also want to thank my husband, my family, my friends, my community. This work is a labor of love, and it took a lot of hours and time, and sometimes just being able to have someone to offer a warm meal after a long day was very significant. And
You have been muted.
Thanking my community partners, Consejo Counseling and Referral Services. This was the community agency that I worked with during the project. And lastly, the University of Washington, the Graduate Opportunity and Minority Achievement Program that provided the dissertation fellowship to be able to fund paying participants for their participation and paying for my analysis team to be able to transcribe and help me with the coding process. So now that I acknowledged all those wonderful people that made this possible, I wanted to talk about what we did, right? So what was the goal of this project to begin with? So this was a qualitative project, so I was interested in uncovering the experiences of the women beyond what we know already in statistics, right, or with numbers. I really wanted to get to their narratives, their stories, of the experiences that the undocumented Latina immigrant women shared, particularly bringing attention to the complexity of their immigration status, ethnicity, gender, and the responses from their communities that impacted their help-seeking behaviors. And I was specifically focusing on formal and informal help. So when I say formal, I'm talking about professionals, service providers, which many of us would probably fall under that category. And then informal help or support, I'm talking about family, friends, faith-based leaders, and even at times neighbors, complete strangers, but people that intervene when they saw the violence happening. Just to kind of contextualize, I think all of this information will be very familiar to many of you that are currently, if you're living in the United States, living in the United States without immigration documents. And this has definitely intensified the fear, especially with ongoing detainments and deportations. The changes that we've seen to deferred action for childhood arrivals, the DACA program, recent travel bans that have come from the presidential office. And, you know, so I don't want to say too much here because I feel like folks are seeing this in their communities, and oftentimes in the work that we do, we're seeing that some of these arrests by ICE agents and detainments are influencing the climate of fear that are impacting the reporting to authorities about cases of domestic violence or sexual assault. Going back to what I mentioned about the fear to report, we're also seeing this impacting social services, right? So we have
I forgot my password.
This fear of deportation is impacting how folks are engaging with social services that they're eligible for. We're not going to watch this video now, but you have the link available once you get the PowerPoint at the end of the presentation. And you can, if you want to watch it, or just to summarize here, this woman,
I'll do that now.
$200 a month for her home budget because she's afraid to continue accessing food assistance that her children are eligible for. But as she mentions in this video, she says it isn't worth the risk of being deported. So we're seeing this happening in our work now. And this brings me to the issue of mixed status families. So we know that, when you have mixed status immigrant families, so these are folks that have different immigration statuses within the family, and they can come in there's different compositions or typologies of these families. Oftentimes we see that one child or some of the younger children are born in the U.S. or they're documented citizenships or have legal documentation, while maybe the parents or older siblings are undocumented. They don't have the legal authorities from immigration to live in the U.S. So this complicates this conversation because we have people with different statuses that have access to different kinds of social support. And most importantly here, I'm trying to show with this graph from the Migration Policy Institute is that a critical point is that 79% of the children with undocumented parents are U.S. citizens. So we're talking about a really large percentage of young children that their parents are unauthorized. So this is, those mixed families I'm talking about where things get a little more complicated for their situations. In regards to domestic violence among Latinos and Latinas, we know that the rate of 1 in 3 that will experience domestic violence during their lifetime is almost similar to that of other women from different ethnic and racial backgrounds. But we have also found in studies that Latino youth that witness domestic violence are at a higher rate for poor health outcomes, which is of concern. And then here, before I move into my study, one last thing I wanted to mention. This is a research project by Professor Sokolov that did work across various industrialized countries. So this is not just the United States, it's looking at multiple countries. And they're seeing that non-immigrant women, so citizen women of the country, are almost twice as likely as documented immigrant women and 4 times as likely as undocumented women to file police reports. So this is indicating a greater fear of reporting to authorities by immigrants. There's a distrust to reach out to authorities, especially when we think about the systems that we have in place to intervene in the domestic violence. Okay, so what did I do? And I include we here. So what did we do? Because as part of this research study, we started with the principles of community-based participatory research. So what do I mean by this? Here's a definition from some of the folks that do CBPR work, but really what it comes down to is we want this process of research to be collaborative. We want partners, whether it's the survivors themselves, practitioners in the field, like especially with the community partner I was working with. We want to be able to recognize their unique strengths and also for them to have an opportunity to weigh in what's the topic of importance and how do we combine this knowledge into action for social change. So for me, this was very important because as I was, I had been working in this community for over 4 years before we even did the research. So I was building trust with the community, getting to know folks in the community that were active around these issues. And towards the end, as I was talking to some of the survivors themselves, they really informed how we phrased the questions, what type of questions we included in the interview questionnaire, as well as then how do we share this information, right? So many times when I was at community meetings trying to, recruiting folks to participate, I was constantly reminded, right? It's like the folks I was talking to, they would say, I'm not going to read your 300-page report or dissertation that you need to produce for the university. How are you going to use this information to actually impact what's going on in our day-to-day? So for me, I had a strong commitment to stay or to work with that in the project. So later on, I might mention.
You have been muted.
I also want to talk about Testimonio because I think even if you're not a researcher or, you think about qualitative research as interviews or talking to people about their lives, I was particularly using this methodology of testimonio. When we're talking about testimonio, we're talking about utilizing storytelling and narratives to document oppressed people's experiences of struggle, survival, and resistance. And I think here it's key to highlight that it's not just about the struggle, it's also about how folks are surviving their experiences as well as how they're resisting. I use a lot of the work of Dr. Lindsay Perez-Uber. She's at Cal State Long Beach in California, and when she defines what testimonio is, she refers to this as a witness speaking to reveal the racial, class, gendered, and nativist injustices that they have suffered as a means of healing, empowerment, and advocacy. Dr. Kaylina Brabeck at Rhode Island College also talks about testimonio as not claiming universal representation, but really focusing on a collectively experienced reality. And I have to say that this was one of the biggest components of why I use this culturally relevant methodology, because the participants, the women I interviewed, would often say, we know we're not the only ones out there that have experienced these things. So we want our experience to inform those that come after us, right? The next generation, the people in our community that are still living in situations where violence is present in their home. So that was a big part of why we use testimonio. So the final definition that we ended up using for this project was that testimonio is a verbal journey of one's life experiences with attention to injustices one has suffered and the effects these injustices have had on one's life. So really, if I were to condense this into one sentence, I would say testimonios is about sharing stories with a purpose. And for these women, that purpose was to, or is, to change the experience of future generations. Just to highlight a little of the research process that took place as we had a system to collect these narratives. I started recruitment of the participants at the agency there at Washington State that I mentioned earlier. They specialize on mental health services for Latino and Latina populations. For the women to be able to participate, they had to identify as undocumented or in the process of legalizing their immigration status. And I'll share more details of how many folks were undocumented and how many were in the process. So I'll share that momentarily. The interviews that I did, I met with 20 women, all Spanish speaking. The interviews were conducted in Spanish. All of them lived in Western Washington State. And we met individually twice. So I met them one time, and then like 2 weeks later, we would meet up again. And some of the topics that we covered in the interview included their experiences before migrating to the United States, their immigration journey, their experiences being undocumented, exposure to intimate partner violence, and then their help-seeking responses and community responses from both formal and informal, and future goals and hopes. Just to mention here the process of reflection. So part of conducting qualitative interviewing involves this continuous process of reflection on the research. So this process of reflexivity is examining both myself as a researcher and the research relationship. So what I mean by this is I had to be aware of the importance of the relationships I was developing, not only with the community, but also the women that were being invited to participate in the research. As you may know, sharing about their immigration status is something very personal. So there had to be a whole process of reflecting of how we would engage the community in a safe way without disclosing any personal information about the women and putting them at risk. I also had to be aware of the cultural connections. I identify as Latina. Some of the women, maybe we were not from the same, my parents are not from the same country of origin as they are. But I really do think that identifying as a Latina woman helped to be able to make those transitions a little easier. So, for example, most of the interviews happened at the women's homes or their place of residence. So, just being invited into a person's home to interview them about a very sensitive information that they were going to be sharing, I had to be aware of what that process may bring up. I had to be, aware of, when somebody invites you a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, a little bit of food, how that would then kind of interpret our conversation that would happen afterwards. And also, as part of the research, I had to go through human subjects, so the institutional review board at the university, to approve that the work that I was doing was ethical. I was following ethical guidelines. So part of that required that the follow-up that I could have with the women was very limited. So I had to be very careful of not instilling false hopes in the women that we were going to become friends, or, it's like this was a research project and we had contact while the interviews were going on, but then afterwards, I may or may not see them in the community. So what would that look like? And also reminding myself that I was wearing a researcher hat at the moment, not an advocate hat. I'm not an attorney, like all the things that came up during the interviews because the women knew that I had experience working in the field. So, like that I had to constantly go back and forth and grapple with. And I think here the last thing I want to say is the picture that you see here in this slide is actually from one of my aunties in Mexico, a few of them, hand embroidered these napkins that I gifted to the women at the end of their interviews. So again, like this process of reflexivity allowed me to go a little bit deeper into like my own cultural upbringings of what I knew would be an appropriate gift that also had a symbolism of the labor of love that was taking place, and that it was coming from different parts of the world, and acknowledging the labor of my aunties that, they got compensated for, but also just the labor of love that goes into it. Okay, so before I take questions, let me just tell you who the 20 women were, or a little bit of who these women were. So I conducted the interviews between 2013 and 2014. 6 of the women arrived in the United States between 1991 and 1995. 10 arrived between 1996 and 2000, and 4 arrived 2001 to 2005. So you can tell just from this graph that most of these women had been living in the United States for at least a minimum of 8 years, all the way to like 20 plus years, those that had come early in the 1990s. The majority of the women were from Mexico, 16 of them, and then I had 2 interviewees from El Salvador, and 2 interviewees from Guatemala. The average age of the interviewee was 38 years old. They had an average of 3 children. When I asked them about the length of their last relationship where there was violence, it ranged from 1 to 22 years, with an average of 9 years in their relationship. And then when I asked about the length they had been out of the relationship, it was anywhere from 6 months to 8 years, with an average of 3 years being out of the relationship. In regards to the women, about their immigration status, so 13 of them identified as undocumented, and 4 of them had approved, of those 13, 4 of them had approved U visas. And then I break apart those that had a current U visa, so a visa for victims of crime and domestic violence being included as part of that list of crimes that are eligible. These women, as you all would know, or I guess let me step back. These women could potentially be able to later legalize their status depending how long they've had their U visa, but all of these folks had their U visa. So in the bigger scope of things, they would still be undocumented, right? Or like, it's this weird space to be in regards to immigration status. So I just wanted to tease that out a little bit more to give more context. And then 2 of the women had become recent legal permanent residents. Recent, I would say in the last 6 months from when I interviewed them. One woman, when I came to her house, she had just received the letter from immigration with her resident card, with her green card. So, I mean, this was very, very recent, so they were still able to share experiences of when they were undocumented. In regards to their partners' immigration status, 14 of their partners were also undocumented. 3 were U.S. citizens and 3 were legal permanent residents. I have a table here if people are interested in seeing how this breaks up when we look at the partner as well as the survivor. So if you look at that top line, those are the undocumented women survivors that they had no visa filed yet. So 5 of them had undocumented ex-partners, 2 of them had U.S. citizen ex-partners. The next line there is undocumented survivors that had applied for a U visa, but they were pending decision. So there was 4 of them, as I had mentioned earlier. There were 2 folks that had a U visa approved, and they were pending getting their work permit. So these folks already knew it had been approved, but they still hadn't received their work permit in the mail. And then 5 of them are the ones that already had their U visa. They had obtained a work permit, so they were, a little bit closer on the line. And if you're thinking about like the progression of legal status, and then the 2 women that were legal permanent residents. One of them, her partner was also a legal permanent resident. Another one, a U.S. citizen. And actually, both of these women that they got the LPR, their legal permanent residency via VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act process, to be able to legalize their immigration status. And then the other person was a victim of human trafficking, so she was able to get her status after the visa. Okay, last piece here before I open it to questions. I wanted to mention that the women I interviewed had not just been exposed to intimate partner violence as adults. These women also had experienced other type of trauma during their lives. For example, 11 women talked about witnessing intimate partner violence as a child in their own homes with their parents or, partners of their parents. 7 of the women reported sexual assault or abuse as a child or as a teenager. Over half of them reported some kind of abuse from an employer in the United States, and that included both verbal and sexual abuse or assault. And then 1 person reported a human trafficking experience in their lifetime. So before I move forward, I know that was a lot of info, so I wanted to open up for just a few, if there's any questions that we can take right now, maybe to clarify any of the information I just shared before I move forward with the findings.
Hi, Miriam. There's a question. The majority of women experience multiple forms of abuse?
I'm assuming this question is about the abuse in the intimate partner violence relationship. Just want to make sure I understand.
Yes. They're typing trauma experiences.
Oh, trauma experiences.
Yes.
Yes, yeah. So they did have multiple forms of abuse, right? As I mentioned earlier, there was, a big representation of the women talking about other types of sexual assault and in other times of their life, right? Like when they were younger or with different people it was not their ex-partner. And then also witnessing the violence as a child. And then for me, one thing that really struck out for me was how many of them were talking about abuse in the U.S. by employers. Because even though we weren't asking, there was no specific question about that, we have over half of them talking about these experiences.
So there's folks typing, seems like folks are typing their question, but I definitely wanted to thank you for sharing your own history and sharing your identity in the process, Miriam. I think that's so important for folks to understand that a lot of the work that we do as, in this case, we're talking as Latino communities, this is not just a theoretical perspective we're talking about, because these things that you're mentioning are things that impact within our own communities and the whole issue around anti-immigrant sentiment. So I really want to express my appreciation for you just sharing your identity and how important that is, that you're not just a researcher, but also giving foundation as to why you did this research and why you do what you do.
You're welcome. Thank you. Yeah, and I have another picture here of my auntie's work. I feel like I can't tell you how many tears of joy and tears of, just gratitude were shared by the women, by myself, after we were finishing the interviews. I mean, I think that gesture, and, and I would tell them the story, right? I would tell them who my aunties were, like the process of getting the napkins mailed from Mexico, making them arriving to Seattle, and it really did connect us in a very intimate way. Are there any other questions before I move to the next part of the presentation?
It doesn't seem like, Miriam, so
okay.
If you want to proceed.
We will move on. Awesome. So this is where I get to more of the meat or the narratives of what the women shared during their interviews, their Testimonio interviews. So here we get to hear from their own experiences. I will use quotes from their interviews. And again, just as a reminder, all the names I'm using are alias names to protect the identity of the interviewees. So when I talk about their experience, they're alias names. They're not the real names. So before I get to the common experiences that the women talked about in regards to domestic violence, I want to first talk about this larger scope that came up as the women were talking about their experience living in the United States as undocumented immigrants. So this came across in these two larger themes or common experiences where they would talk about how they would interact socially, day to day, in their environments, and then how their personal relationships would be impacted because of their status. So I'll start with social interactions. Most of them talked about, not knowing how to get help, being new or arriving to the United States. A lot of them talked about how they came to the United States to work and how they had more options here than back home. And I think most importantly here, they kept talking about how they don't share their immigration status. And I'm assuming that this is not going to be a new revelation for people, right? It's like, people, this is very private. You don't talk about this. But I just thought it was interesting how they kept bringing it up. A lot of their own friends that they had met, either through transitional housing or through different social support groups, they would not share about their immigration status. In regards to their personal relationships, a lot of them shared about experiencing fragmented communities. And what I mean here is when they would first migrate to the United States, they would have support from family members or friends that had come to the U.S. before them, but it was temporary because oftentimes by the second week that they were in the U.S., a common response they would hear is, well, everyone in the U.S. works, you have to work, so you have to find a job to be able to pay rent, to be able to get food on the table. Just the community wasn't able to provide the type of support that the women had envisioned when they were first migrating. A lot of them talk about how they were very isolated, so that meant that they didn't have a lot of friends. And they also talked about family members that stayed behind in their country of origin. So this idea of having families connected across nation states, right, or the transnational family. And, not surprisingly, they talked about not trusting other people with their immigration status. And here, they wouldn't, they would talk about how they wouldn't trust people with their status, even if they were folks that they knew well, right? It's like that's something they would talk about. The group of women that I interviewed did reach out for services, formal services. So I do want to make that point that regardless of their status, the women were able to seek help more long-term. Maybe not at the beginning of the experiences of violence, but more as they got connected with community or understanding where to look for help. So all the women I interviewed had some type of legal, like a protection order that was related to the domestic violence. A lot of them had been at transitional housing or shelters. You can see from this table here that only 50% of them, or only 10 of them, had reported to the police department any of the violence that had happened. And then a lot of them were getting services either for legal assistance around their immigration status, support groups that offered emotional support, arts-based therapy, financial counseling. About half of them were talking about receiving some kind of therapy or counseling. A lot of them would reach out to charity programs, often nonprofit organizations that would offer assistance with food, utilities, bus passes, and clothing for them and their children. And here, the next few programs I have in bold because these are programs we think about when we think about social services or social provisions, right? We think about WIC as a nutritional program, food stamps, TANF, cash assistance, emergency medical assistance. And I highlight in orange TANF because there was only 3 women that actually looked for that help. So, just to keep in mind when we hear these misconceptions of how immigrants are draining our system, are going on cash assistance. I mean, at least from this group and other people I've talked to, usually this number is very low. And for those of us that do this work, we know that because of the process of trying to later in the future, if they're able to legalize or make their immigration status, be a legally permanent resident, et cetera, these kind of things of being a public charge are an issue, right? So it also makes sense in that regard that they probably wouldn't want to reach out if they were worried that it would impact future immigration applications, et cetera. So I'm going to move to the next slide, and I realized I forgot to put the name of the woman that shared this story. So I need to let you know this was Esmeralda. And when Esmeralda was talking about seeking help from medical emergency assistance, this was the story she shared, which was very impactful of what she encountered when she looked for this help. So she begins talking about what got her to the hospital. She had gone, there was a physical violence by her partner towards her. So she ended up in at the emergency room. And then she goes on to say what the doctor did, right, when they were in the examination room. So the doctor turned his back toward her husband, and he told me in the ear, this is her talking, if he hits you, I can help you. He said it clearly in Spanish for me. For me, it was like hearing a ghost. I looked at him. I got very scared when I saw him, her husband, sitting there. And he got up to ask the doctor, what is wrong with her, doctor? He asked him in English. He told him other things, but I did not understand the language well. The doctor told him it's fine. He told him to sit down. My husband goes and sits down, and the doctor said, I can help you if he hits you. I didn't know what to do. I said no. I shook my head no. My husband wanted to leave the hospital, so I was not able to speak. The doctor told him to wait because he had taken x-rays. I said I fell. Nothing happened. I wanted to highlight this story because it was very interesting to hear her narrate this particular experience where for her, seeing this doctor who was non-Latino, so when she heard him speaking Spanish, she was surprised, right, because she didn't expect the doctor to speak Spanish. But because of the circumstance where her husband was also in the room, in the examination room, she was scared. She wasn't able to say what had happened. and she froze, right? So the doctor was not able to do anything for her in that circumstance. When we talk more specifically about how the women experienced seeking help for the domestic violence while being undocumented, these are the four slices of the pie here are the four main themes that came up from their stories, from their narratives. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on manipulation and isolation because I feel like the group of the audience here has probably heard a lot of these different stories where women are threatened for deportation, their partners manipulate them with the status of either their children or themselves. They use the children to manipulate women to not report the violence. The women talked about being isolated, so not having a lot of resources or having limited awareness of what was available because they were so isolated. But I really want to give you more information about the next two big themes, differential treatment and ongoing stress. Because this is where the women shared very unique stories of what it looks like, how this happened in their experience. So for example, when we're talking about differential treatment, we're talking about how the women were treated differently when they did seek help. Oftentimes because they were told they were not eligible due to their immigration status. They had to wait longer for services due to their immigration status, and oftentimes they felt discriminated. And I'll give you examples in a moment. In regards to ongoing stress, the two main things they would, there's all kinds of stress, as they had to leave the home and trying to figure out how to make ends meet. But the two big common threads that kept coming up was how they were blamed for their partner's immigration problems. As you remember, a lot of their partners were also undocumented. So if they did report the abuse to police authorities or did any kind of legal actions, that could have a repercussion towards their partners if they were trying to legalize their immigration status. And a lot of times, financial assistance concerns were a problem. Here are two example quotes from their stories that talk about how they felt they were treated differently. So Victoria talks about how every place asks you for a good social security number, right? So here she's talking about how when she was seeking particularly housing, she was told she needed a good social. And if you don't have one, they tell you you don't qualify, but your kids do. So for her, this was very confusing because she's like, okay, if my girls qualify and I don't, how are my girls going to go and be by themselves, right? My girls are going to be by, how are they going to be by themselves? So this was very confusing for her until she figured out, her case manager helped her navigate that. But, just to have that information provided to her was very confusing. And then Jimena talks about just how she feels that sometimes undocumented folks are represented, right? So she shares, sometimes they emphasize that American citizens pay taxes for us to have these things. They make you feel like you're asking for charity. They make you feel like you're being dependent on them when you say, I too have work. I too have paid taxes. Why is it that now that I need the help, it's being used against me? And here I have to say that when she's talking about they, who's they, she was talking about practitioners and professionals. So when she was going through transitional housing programs, when she was seeking counseling and legal advocacy, a few times she heard people, kind of make judgment or say things about, well, you have these things because citizens are paying your taxes for you to have these things. And, she highlights here one of those misconceptions that all undocumented people don't pay taxes, which is not necessarily accurate. In regards to ongoing stress, here are just some brief quotes from different women. So Milagros talks about one of the responses her husband gave her when she reported the abuse. He told her, he would always tell me, she says, who is going to pay your bills? The police aren't going to do that or aren't going to do it. Marcela talks about her experience where she experienced with the ongoing stress. So she says, for almost a month, I was on the street suffering and navigating because it was very difficult to get shelter for my family. I have 5 children. At first, I didn't know until they told me the truth. It is hard for you to occupy 2 rooms that are not available. I, or we, because she had her kids with her, slept on the street, in the parks, and in hotels. So these 2 quotes highlight some of the financial issues, right, that the women experience after leaving the abusive partner. And Jimena here at the end talks about what she heard from her family, from her in-laws, when she decided to report the violence from her ex-husband. This is another thing, her ex-husband's deportation, that they blame me for. His mom told me that I should have waited 5 more years, but I could not endure another day. Nope, I did not care. I was not going to tolerate him disrespecting me. So even though, she was blamed for her partner's immigration issues because he did get deported, she moved forward with her decision to report the abuse and get her children into a safer environment than in their home. I do have to mention that part of obtaining services also meant that, there were moments, a lot of these, right, moments where the women felt that they received a lot of help from formal services, from practitioners, from professionals. This idea, tener confianza, or feeling trust, right, or having these trusting relationships, this is what it meant for them, right? If they felt safe, whatever it was that that person or that program shared with them that made them feel safety, that they felt listened to or cared for. They often talked about, feeling confident in the competence of the person that was working with them. Did they understand the system, right? Did they understand what it meant to file a U visa application and the forms that need to be filled out and the affidavit that needs to get submitted by, all these folks that are a part of the process. So they talked about, do I feel confident that the person or the people that are helping me understand what's happening? So if they do, they felt like it was helpful. They received help to navigate the services. They were told they were not alone, and they felt inspired and hopeful. So these characteristics help them navigate services better, even though they were undocumented immigrants. And here I have one last slide before I open it up to questions again, because I know I've shared a lot of information through their narratives. But I wanted to mention that as part of the interview, we were asking, what has worked? What has been helpful? What responses from both formal and informal social supports have been helpful for you? Or, or what things have not worked, right? Like how are people responding to your experience? And as you can tell on the column around formal help seeking, so seeking help from professionals, all of them talked about some kind of barrier, right? All 20 of them mentioned some kind of barrier they experienced. But almost as many, 18 of them talked about some of these helpful instances, which included stuff that I mentioned in the previous slide. And a lot of them still felt the stigma, they felt fear, they felt distrust of some folks. And at times they described very vivid oppressive practices. So I have an example I'm going to share here, but half of the women had very unique experiences around this issue. But one of the women, her name here, Santa, talked about her experience in a shelter, when she was in a shelter, an emergency shelter for a while with her young daughter. And she was sharing, she had a roommate at the shelter, non-Latina, a white woman with a little baby as well. And within the first 2 or 3 days that Santa was in the shelter, this woman, her roommate, started treating her like her maid, right? She would start telling her, like, well, you need to watch my kid. I'm going to take a nap. You take care of my child. Can you feed my child? Can you bathe my child? And then it got to the point where, like she was expecting Santa to clean up after, like clean the room. And it was done in this way of like, well, if you tell, like the caseworkers or, the housing director, whoever, any of the professionals in the area, I'm going to tell them that you did, like she would threaten her that, she was going to say something against her to get her kicked out of the shelter. Unfortunately, it did get to the point where it escalated to an aggressive verbal and close to physical argument between the two of them, where Santa had to leave the shelter. It sounds like, from what she shared, the professionals that were informed about the situation, the way that they responded was by having her transferred to another shelter. And nothing happened to the other client. In regards to informal help-seeking responses, so this is how family and community responded when they were seeking help. Oftentimes they got this, the people would tell them that it was not their business to get involved. It's like, this is between your husband or your boyfriend or your partner, your children's father to deal with. Like, we can't, we don't want to get involved. Oftentimes, the interactions were expected to be very gendered. So this idea, as a woman, you tolerate this type of abuse or these types of actions because you're married to this man, or you have kids with this man. This is just part of life, right? And some of their mothers or aunties or folks, that had experienced violence in their own relationships would just kind of come back and say, well, I've experienced that too. Like, you will get through this too, right? So it wasn't necessarily always negative, but it was this idea that it was just expected, that this is what relationships are like. 14 of the women talked about family or community only offering temporary support. There was a woman, Carmen, where she called her brother during an situation where she had to call the police to come to her home after a violent altercation. And her brother came to help her translate, but soon after that, so after that whole incident where the police came, brother translated for her, her brother never called her back after that. So she felt like, he just stopped talking to her. He was the only family member she had close by. And, it was hard for her to talk about this because she shared how, yeah, he came to help me and help me translate, but it seemed like soon after, like, he just didn't want anything to do with me or with my children. Lastly, I wanted to just mention here the culture of silence. 14 women also talked about different experiences where people would respond in this way of keeping the violence silent, this idea that, you don't talk about it. Sometimes this would manifest in different ways. So you have some women talking about their sister-in-laws offering them makeup to cover up bruises on their faces so that, they would be presentable, or, people wouldn't know what had happened the night before. Or times when women knew that there was folks either next door, in the room next door, hearing what was happening, but doing nothing about it. One of the women, Linda, talked about this because she had to, like, flee and go to it was a fire station that was close to her apartment. And so it happened, there was commotion, like, at 2 in the morning in her apartment complex, and she kept saying, I don't believe that my neighbors didn't hear what was happening. So, like, this idea of, like, what happens when others are aware or hear things that are going on in these situations. So questions that people have.
Hi, Miriam. This is Jose Juan. So there was a question here. Are law enforcement being trained to assess the situation before they make a judgment call?
I would hope so. I think this looks different in different states and even different cities. I know when I was in California, I participated in a lot of these trainings for law enforcement, and part of what I learned through those trainings when I would attend was that some of the calls, when it is a call around domestic violence, can be very volatile situations, right? So I would hear law enforcement folks talking about how for them it was also a risky situation to go in and then assess what was happening. But I can tell you that just from these stories that the women were sharing, I don't think it's happening across the board. I mean, I talk to women that after they called the police would come out. They would never address the women directly. Like, they would never ask any questions of the women because they didn't speak English and they didn't have a translator. And then they would leave, right? Even though there was clear evidence that there had been violence. Like, one of the women said, like her tooth had been broken, or she had been pushed to the floor, so she had like something broken in her face. Like, you could see it in her face. And she was left there. Like, they took no report and they left. So you can imagine, like, the situation got a lot more tense after the police left, and she was left there with her children and her partner.
I think it's, this is Jose Juan again, Miriam. It's important to note that you mentioned the issue around language access, which is a systemic barrier which may prevent communication or clear communication from a responding officer who may not know how to speak Spanish or any other language for that matter. And I think beyond that, I know at Casa Esperanza, or National Latina Network, we do a lot of training across the country. So, and like you mentioned, yes, it varies from state to state and from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But I think also beyond that, most of the time, whether it's law enforcement or service providers or victim advocates, we're trained to assess the dynamic of domestic violence or sexual assault or whatever the interpersonal violence that's happening, but not really apply a culturally responsive dynamic to it, like around language access issues or how a certain community may respond as a whole to issues around intimate partner violence. So I think the question becomes is, are all of us who are first responders or frontline folks having some type of training around how to be culturally responsive and not just dealing with the dynamic of domestic violence or intimate partner violence, but also culturally responsive to the person's ethnic or cultural identity that they may possess. So another question, how much time did each interview take?
Each interview took anywhere from an hour to 2 hours, and I met with them twice. So, yeah, we're talking about anywhere from 2 hours to 4 hours total of talking to the women. And in some situations, a little bit longer, just depending on what stories came up. But for the most part, I would say anywhere from an hour to 2 hours per interview.
Folks are typing. And I don't know if you're going to address this later on in your conversation, Miriam, but are you going to caution folks around not stereotyping the community based on what you just discussed? Because I sometimes feel that when research is done around certain communities and people who don't identify with those communities, there are a lot of assumptions. I mean, as it is, as participants or folks who may not identify with those communities come in with all these internalized isms, as it is. So I don't know if you're going to kind of address that as part of your conversation today.
Yeah, I feel like I didn't write it down anywhere, but I'm glad you're bringing that up. Because, yeah, I think with research, we do want to be careful, right? And part of this idea of not having all these stories necessarily come to one assumption of what this looks like for everyone. I think with this Testimonios, it's a collection of their various narratives, and every narrative was very unique. And unfortunately, I think, we do this as researchers, right? It's like we try to lump together our data to be able to say, like, what are common experiences? What are themes that these women are sharing? But yes, I would caution everyone that, and even as an insider, right, as a Latina, there were times where, as I was being reflexive, I had to be mindful, right? It's like not everyone grew up in a Catholic home like I did, so they may have a different view of what relationships between two people look like, or how they parent their kids, Or even, because oftentimes I would share about my parents coming to the United States and, just as a part of relating with the women and sharing my own story with these issues. And that also reminded me that we don't all have that same narrative of immigrants, even if we're coming from the same country. So absolutely, I would say we want to caution how we interpret the information and what it means when we're talking about 20 women, right, from Washington State, which would look different in another state, perhaps.
Right, and to further comment on that, just the term immigrant itself carries a lot of perceptions already as those of us who may be listening to this webinar, right, because of what the misconstruction or deconstruction of just having that label placed on a lot of us who,
right.
and it seems like, and this is my perspective, that the term immigrant equates to Latinos, and Latino communities have become the face of immigrant communities, when in fact immigrant communities come in from many diverse communities. So just cautioning folks on just around the terminology of the title of this webinar, which is amazing, by the way. But, just the certain terminology and certain keywords that folks who are researchers may use in their entitling their research, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. No, I appreciate that. Thank you. I'm going to move along just for the interest of time. I see that we've got about 20 minutes left. So I just wanted to share here, this is a picture of one of the murals that the women were, they co-created. So a lot of the women were a part of an art-based therapy group at one of the locations for the agency where I did most of my recruitment. And so as part of my analysis, I also wanted to know how they were narrating their story. So I wasn't interested in just what they had to say, but how they were saying it, right? So how were they conveying their word choice, their phrasing, their tone as we were talking. So there was a whole analysis around that, which I can't get into all the details in this webinar, but I do want to highlight that part of this process meant also stepping outside of the narrative and looking at some of the artwork that the women were sharing with me, because this mural was painted, I want to say like 2 weeks before I started doing my recruitment. So several women during the interviews would keep saying like, oh, have you seen the mural? Or, like, have you gone downstairs? And so I'm like, okay, I need to go see this, because then they would start talking about what that process did for them in regards to their own healing and connecting to other survivors that were going through similar things. And also, I want to kind of mention like these two larger themes that kept coming across when the women were telling their story. So here Carmen describes the struggle that continued for her, and this is particularly around her U visa application. So she's talking about how without a Social Security number, she couldn't do a lot of things. And she says, once you submit your paperwork to the immigration attorney, supposedly you can't work because you ask for a pardon, then you can no longer work. So what is the help? The government knows we don't have a Social Security and they're helping us. Why not give us the tools to begin working, or a provisional permit while everything else arrives? Many of us have a deep yearning to have this. So Carmen, as I was talking to her in her second interview, this became a big part of the struggle she was seeing ongoing in her life. And I think she points also to the process of the U visa being very intricate, right? And it's complicated. And after you submit paperwork, what happens in that lull time that you're waiting to hear back? So I thought it was really interesting that she raised that, because it was during the same time that VAWA 2013 was getting reauthorized. So the conversation was happening at this larger level with the government, with policymakers, but here you have Carmen also talking about what it looks like for her in her life, like day to day. She had to work, right? So a lot of times she would sell food, she would clean houses to be able to get some cash, to be able to pay rent, to feed her kids. but she kept having a difficult time understanding why is it that during this wait there's not something that can help us get ready for or have some kind of provisional permit to help us start moving forward in our lives. Another common experience that the women talked about was how they witnessed strength amidst the chaos and uncertainty. So Milagros talked about, like her own process of coming to the awareness of the strength. And she says, love yourself because sadly we have a pattern of not loving ourselves. As a Latina woman is molded or expected to be a woman that suffers, a woman that is limited to things and you tolerate it. No freaking way. We don't need to take it. We need to break that mold. We definitely have to work on this much more. We need to end these ideas of being eternal victims and suffering women. We are triumphant women and hardworking. I think these words are very powerful around her experience, but I think here would want to caution, just like Jose Juan mentioned, that this was her experience, right? And sometimes we hear this gendered expectation that women have as Latina women, and for her, this was her experience, and this was her response of how she was trying to work through that. This is another picture from their mural. So it covered about 3 or 4 walls, so it was hard for me to capture it all in one picture. But I just wanted to share this because I think this idea of being able to be free, being able to feel like they're reborn again, or they're free like birds or free like butterflies to fly. Like they used a lot of ways to describe, right, like what their experience was like moving on with their life after the violence, especially for the women that had gotten to a point where they felt like they were healing themselves as well as their family, their children. So why does this matter? A few things that I want to talk about before we open up for larger questions and discussion. I think that these findings are really informing action and change at local conditions, right? So by the women sharing these stories with other survivors, it was critical. So part of what we did, I collaborated with 2 of my community friends or colleagues, and we put together a series of online Spanish radio shows. So it was like an online radio show all in Spanish to share the information, and it would be broadly broadcast. People could hear it not only in the state but in other places. And the main person that is a part of that radio show was able to let us know like how many people are listening in. There was a series, so we had different topics that we covered, and one of the topics we covered was around effects that the violence has on their children, and that radio show was actually got a request that it get aired more than once because people really enjoyed that conversation. That it touched them, right? It reflected something about the experiences they were having. So I do think that these findings allowed us to use the data, the narratives in these more creative ways. And I think there's still room for improvement. I mean, I'm hoping in the future to do more of this. I also think that these findings are pointing to this idea that in our interventions, we're not addressing job training and employment for undocumented survivors. And this is having long-term effects, particularly around obtaining long-term housing for their children and for themselves. And also being aware that there's limited accessibility to police intervention and health settings for the women. And I think this is important because as part of our systemic response, these are 2 places where we expect folks to get support, right? But if they don't have access, that's something that we need to consider. I would also add that there is a need for more cultural responsive practice models that are addressing the issues of mixed status immigrant families. If we can identify barriers sooner, if we can leverage community strengths. I know several of the women talked about how when they were in the transitional housing programs, the programs that they enjoyed the most were those that offered opportunities for them to build community with other survivors, to be able to come together and cook together or have groups where they could engage with each other, and not groups, right? Not the support groups where you sit and share your story and you cry and, you're processing stuff, but really more on this level of connecting human to human, mother to mother, right? Understanding how they could build community, in those settings, but also amongst themselves. And I do think, especially because I'm in the field of social work, for me, another area that I want to explore more is how do we frame social provisions so that we start talking about these benefits, right, or these programs that they're eligible for as a benefit, not as welfare, because we all know that, when we talk about it as welfare, there is a stigma attached to that. Really quick here, I just want to mention that even though I'm talking about domestic violence and intimate partner violence, there's intersections with immigration policies. So if we continue to see police working with ICE, if, E-Verify continues around like checking people are eligible to work, and if the detention holds continue, this is impacting the families in these various ways. Lastly here, before I open up for discussion, I want to say that part of the considerations that I want us to think about and grapple with is this idea of having strategies, right, prevention strategies that are not related to intimate partner violence. So how can we focus on child health, maternal health? I mean, we know that the risk of violence goes up during pregnancy, but also including assessment of intimate partner violence, right? So I know I've talked to a few folks where in different states where they're trying to see how like the WIC office can be a place where information can be shared, because a lot of folks access WIC not necessarily because there's IPV, but they're seeking nutritional assistance for their children. It's like, okay, how can we insert or have some kind of prevention strategy to have information, to have accessibility to programs and services, especially if the communities are experiencing isolation. I think that having this accessibility to these programs may buffer some of those experiences of isolation. And then lastly, I would say this is, it could be around our clinical practice as well as research. When we bring together partnerships that are interdisciplinary, that are community-based, I really think it offers a wider opportunity to see how cultural relevance, cultural responsibility can play a role. I've recently been asked here in Connecticut to work with a colleague in nursing and a colleague in education, where we're trying to understand how are we addressing the needs of migrant children in the schools, because we don't have a migrant children program here in the state of Connecticut. So, we're just trying to see like what are the next steps and how do we reach out and make it change or make a difference in the experiences that the women are having. So with that, I would like to, we have 10 minutes, and any discussion, dialogue, questions that I can answer, I'd be happy to.
So as folks are hopefully typing their questions, Miriam, I think certainly for us here at Casa Esperanza, the whole issue around intersectionality is so important, and it's fundamental to anything that we do as an organization, whether we are talking about public policy, training and technical assistance, or research in the work that we do. And I think you kind of bring those aspects to your research as well. But I guess I just wanted to ask you, how can intersectional framework be overemphasized or underemphasized in any type of research, particularly for those folks or for those researchers who are not of those communities, and they come into our communities, whether it's Latino communities or other, and they don't have that lens?
So the question being how much we use intersectionality as a framework or not?
Yes.
Or?
Yes. Correct.
Yeah. Well, I think, I absolutely think that it's important that we use intersectionality, because even within a group that, like when I think about the criteria for the women to be able to participate in this research, they were, maybe that one adjective describing their immigration status was just one piece, right? It's like if we look at the larger individual and the intersections of their different identities, you start hearing different narratives emerge. I know a few of the women I interviewed that were, that identified with an indigenous group from their country of origin. They would talk about how the discrimination they would experience looked different, right? It wasn't just about them not speaking English. It was about them looking a certain way. I remember one woman breaking down and saying, like, because of my skin color, because I look like an India, those were her words, like as like an Indian or a Native person, I was treated this way. And, people think that I'm less smart, or I don't know what I'm doing, or I don't know how to take care of my child because of how I look. So I think that intersectionality as a framework is absolutely important, because social class can also play a different role in how people are viewed when they're seeking help, not just gender, not just immigration status. I hope that helps. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, yes. And then, of course, this is, when you're talking about intersectional frameworks that you apply across the board, or whatever you do, it is complex, it is very dynamic, and it is very nuanced, right? Because
right.
the culture changes, the dominant culture kind of influences everything else. And so the rest of us who are caught up in that dominant culture perspective, we kind of have to shift a little in order to survive. And I think a lot of times we forget that when we do not apply intersectional framework to whether it's research or advocacy, and whatever aspect that you have or position, whether you're responding as law enforcement or prosecutor or victim advocate or social worker or counselor, or even medical professional, a lot of things will fall away, and which could place that person or those communities in further risk of violence, whether it's in the context of intimate partner violence or perhaps child abuse or elder abuse, and all these interesting other parts of a person's identity. I think that's so important.
Yes, it is. It is. I agree.
So people are typing, hopefully with questions. So there's so people want to know, how would you suggest practitioners use testimonials in their work?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think if you are like a clinician, practitioner, there's definitely opportunities to use testimonial as a way for clients or folks that you're working with to share their story. It's very interesting Testimonio, when I think about it as a methodology and research, right, it's like there's different steps that are recommended. But because the basis is storytelling, a lot of times that's how people are connecting and sharing about themselves in our practice. So I do think that there's ways to incorporate that in your clinical work, or if it's just practitioner work in groups, but also being aware of the levels of how that testimonial evolves, right? So there's a lot of trust building that has to happen, especially if the testimonial is going to be publicly shared, in a support group, if that's what people want to do. Because I do have to say that when I suggested that we run focus groups for this project, it would, across the board, I kept hearing no, right? It's like a lot of the women were saying, it's like, I'm okay sharing with you one-on-one about my status, but even my next door neighbor doesn't know about my status. And they're like at a transitional housing program, and they're like, I don't want them to know. Like, this is private information. So I think we have to think through what that could look like, or how we can use it in a creative way. I think that as I analyzed how women were sharing their testimonios, part of it reminded me of like a theater, right? Or of like, I think about like some of the I don't know if the right word is plays, but like the programming that is done with farm workers, women farm workers, and they talk about sexual assault in the fields, and they do it through drama, right? It's so I think if we think about testimonio as these narratives and stories that are being shared, how can we then use that narrative to provide healing spaces for folks? It's definitely, I think it's definitely something we can use in our toolbox.
So another question, do you see testimonios as an intervention?
I think so. I think that for this project, I did not measure, right? It's like there was no post assessment of how the testimonio intervened or how it provided some kind of intervention for the women. I do have to say, though, that a lot of the women would say the last time I would see them, they'd be like, this has been so helpful just to talk to, they would use the word desahogo, like this releasing of, telling you my stories, like this way of me releasing a lot of the stuff I hadn't shared before. And I wasn't able to bring it into this presentation because there's so much data. But one of the things that I was really struck by was how many stories came up around sexual violence by their partners, and how sometimes the sexual abuse or the rape would result in the person becoming pregnant and then having to process that later on, right? So their child is born, and then as a mother needing to, like, how do you process this trauma? And now you have a child, right, that came from this experience of sexual assault. So in those moments where I really wish I would have done something to understand what was the intervention, because I do think it has the opportunity to be an intervention. But if we're thinking about it in intervention terms that we can measure or follow up, I didn't do that with this project.
And unfortunately, we're close to time, but very quickly, one last question. Is there any resources you would recommend to learn more?
Let me look at the stuff I have in some of my files, and I'll get back to you all. Because there might be something I can share, but I can't think of something right at the top of my, like especially if we're talking about interventions. I don't have something now that I can think of.
Perfect. Not a problem. And like we said at the beginning of the webinar, we will share the presentation along with Dr. Baldovino's contact information as well as any support resources she may have mentioned or she can provide to us. And we can certainly do another webinar. I think this is, like you mentioned, there's a lot of data that you collected, and I think this was a very interesting webinar. So with that said, Miriam, thank you so very much for doing this webinar for us. It was very fascinating, very interesting conversation today. To our participants who joined us today, thank you so very much for being patient with us through the technical difficulties. As we mentioned before, we will share the PowerPoint and any other additional resources Dr. Baldovino has. And again, if you wish to receive more information on these forms of trainings, public policy, training and technical assistance, please make sure to join our listserv at nationallatinanetwork.org. Again, Miriam, thank you so very much. And everyone have a great day.
Thank you.